Good evening, friends and family. I'm Reverend Mia McLean, the Associate Minister for Faith Formation and Community Outreach at Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to an evening with Mark Charles. Before we get into introducing our speaker for the evening, I'd like to share some brief history with you regarding the relaunch of our premier Faith Formation speaker series, Faith in the 21st Century. Previously known as the Jesus Seminar and then Jesus the Christ in the 21st Century, it has also been nicknamed J21 here. This event found a home at Myers Park Baptist Church in 1998 under the direction of the Minister of Adult Education at the time, Reverend Dr. William Doles, and two lay people. Our community began a lecture series inviting nationally renowned Jesus scholars to our church. The scholars led the church in a series of forums, conversations, and sermons, which introduced emerging trends in Christology, particularly related to Jesus of Nazareth. Since its inception, the series has expanded to explore a wide range of issues and perspectives related to individual and communal faith formation. J21 has offered the best of contemporary scholarship by way of Christian theologians and other spiritual teachers to members of Myers Park Baptist and to the general public. It is our hope that through the reimagined faith in the 21st century, a new iteration of J21, we will continue to expand our minds together and grow deeper and closer to God and to our community. We will continue to breathe life through this series in innovative ways as we embrace the evolution of religious and theological scholarship and welcome new voices and ideas. This evening, we welcome Native American author and activist Mark Charles, a dynamic and thought-provoking public speaker, writer, and consultant. Mark Charles is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. Mark teaches with insight into the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and faith in order to help forge a path of healing and conciliation for the nation. He is one of the leading authorities on the 15th century's doctrine of discovery and its influence on U.S. history and its intersection with modern day society. Mark co-authored, along with Soong-Chan Rah, the new book entitled Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. And we are so excited, Mark, to offer you a very warm virtual welcome tonight.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be with you this evening. I'm glad we could put this together.
Yes, thank you. You have the distinct honor of being the first speaker to ever participate in the series via Zoom.
There's a lot of those firsts going on right now due to the pandemic, so.
Yeah. Well, thank you to you and to your wonderful assistant, Melissa, and also to all of you who are joining us tonight for putting up with technology in such a tumultuous time. Before we get started with conversation with Mark Charles, we will have words of blessing by Deleslin Rue George Warren of the Catawba Nation. The land upon which this church rests belongs to the Catawba people. We honor them tonight and always, and will continue to speak their name. The blessing will be followed by a musical selection by Emmy Award nominated percussionist Jim Rock and Tuscarora Cherokee flautist Little Big Eagle. After those events, you will hear from none other than Mark Charles himself.
Tanake Niat Delasan George Warren, Niat Ni Tempru, Yang Isware, Yang Katabare, Haksuna Wanda George Warren, Tatewana Buck George, Haksuna Hakchuye, Dr. Winona Hare, Hakchuna, Catherine Corinne George Warren, Imbarana, Aiden George Warren, Hawo Manu He Kuri, Hawo Manu Adrengre, Hawo Wakit, Hawo Hoksu, Hawo Iswon, Hawo Myers Park Baptist, Hawo Imbara Mark Charles. Hi, everyone. My name is Rue George Warren. I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation. I am the son of former Assistant Chief Buck George, former Executive Director of the tribe, Wanda George Warren. We call ourselves in Catawba the people of the river, Yaisware, because we believe that we've lived along the river since the world began. It's our oldest and most cherished relationship in the world. As is our way, I wanted to give thanks for all of the things the world has given us. I wanted to give thanks to our beautiful earth, our good earth. I wanted to give thanks specifically to the Manu Edrengre, the land of the persimmons, which is what Charlotte currently occupies. I wanted to give thanks to the sky, to the rain, to the sun, to the moon. And I also want to give thanks to you for inviting me to do this land acknowledgement before we bring on the wonderful Mark Charles. The thing that I wanted to share is that the land is in a constant process of blessing us. Even when we do not treat it right, it continues to provide us air, sunshine, water, food. And so as we're hearing from Mark Charles, I'd really like to encourage everyone to think about the ways that we can turn around and share those blessings back to the earth and back to each other. It's all that Manu, it's all that the earth asks. Hawo.
Thank you. Thank you to Jim Brock and Little Big Eagle. Thank you to Rue George Warren. And also a thank you to Wes Cobb, who has been videoing us for the past couple of weeks and making sure that we can present to you these very special musical performances. Mark, I would love to begin our conversation with a little bit of storytelling. We'd love to hear some of your story and how it has shaped your social justice work, especially for those who have not read the book yet and who are interested in learning a little bit more about you. So I invite you to share with us some of that story.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin just by introducing myself. So, Yate, Mark Charles Yinishia, Tsin Bake Dene Nishle, do Tohiglini Bashichin, Tsin Bake Dene Dashachedo Toluchini Dashnala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people with our identities coming from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Tsin Bake Dene. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsin Bake Dene. And then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toduchitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today in the lands now known as Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I've had the chance to meet some of the Piscataway. They are still here. They are the host people of these lands. I am humbled to be living on their lands, and I want to honor them as the stewards of these lands. It is with great humility that I speak to you from the land of the Piscataway today. My story, we could go a long way. One of the things I talk a lot about when I travel a lot, and when I tend to travel to more Western cities and meet with more both white as well as just Western culture people, when you ask them who they are, most of the time they will tell you what their occupation is. Well, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, I'm a teacher, I'm unemployed, I work as a clergy. They'll tell you your occupation. And when you go to a Native person and ask, who are you? Most of the times we will tell you who our relationships are. These are our families. This is who we belong to. These are the family members we came from. These are our ancestors. And so part of my story already begins, which is by telling you who I am. How I got into the work that I'm doing is probably I was right around early 2000s, about 2003, I was invited to be called to be the pastor of a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And I arrived there and I was pastoring a church that had been a church to the Native community in Denver for about 30 or 40 years from the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Reformed denomination. And in my first council meeting, my members of my council, the elders and the deacons, said to me that the last pastor had introduced them into the process of contextualizing worship for Indigenous culture. And they wanted me to lead them in that. I said, that sounds great. How do you spell it? Like, I didn't know what they were talking about. And they said, well, there's a conference going on in Hawaii in a few months. It's called the World Christian Gathering on Indigenous Peoples. And we would like to send you and your wife there, your family there, with a few members of the church to engage in these relationships and learn about this process of contextualizing worship. So I said to my council, I said, for nothing other than the sake of the gospel, I will pick up my cross and board the plane and go to Hawaii with my wife for a couple of weeks. And so we traveled to Hawaii, and it was an amazing experience. We were hosted by the indigenous peoples of the islands of Hawaii. And there were indigenous Christians from all over the world. And that began a journey of maybe almost 10 years, 8 to 10 years of me being in relationship with, being mentored by, and even mentoring other indigenous Christians from around the world who were in the process of what I would call decolonizing the gospel for our own cultures. Most indigenous Christians, no matter whether they're here in the US or whether they're some other place around the world, their experience with Christianity almost always begins with colonization, where Western Christians came to their lands, whether it was in South Africa, New Zealand, parts of Europe, all over the world. They came and they colonized the lands and they brought their faith with them. That's what happened here in the US. And so through the process of Manifest Destiny, through the process of boarding schools, the Native communities were forcibly assimilated to Western European culture and therefore presented the gospel. My grandparents were a part of that. Both my grandparents are boarding school survivors, and they became Christians in the boarding schools. Now, the Christianity they were presented said to them that God loves you if you become like an American. So you have to give up your pagan culture, you have to give up your pagan language, you have to give up your pagan beliefs and understandings, and you have to assimilate to the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. And that's what happened, you know. So you have a lot of Native peoples like my grandparents who gave up their culture so that they could have faith, so that they could become Christian. And that's how my family was raised. My father was raised in a Christian household. So because my grandparents were colonized in that way, they didn't teach my father the language. So he didn't know the language to speak it to me. And so as I was going through this journey with these other indigenous Christians from all around the world, because I had grown up in a border town to the Navajo Nation, because I didn't grow up speaking my language, because I had never lived on the Navajo Nation, our reservation, I realized if I really want to continue in this process, I need to go back to our reservation. So we were in the church in Denver for 2 years. And after 2 years, my wife and I decided it was really time to intentionally go back to the Navajo Nation and live on our traditional lands, in our traditional communities. And so we moved back there. And there was a member of our church, actually a relative by clan, and his wife, who was also a boarding school survivor, had a traditional hogan in a remote section of our reservation, and told my wife and I that we could move there. And so we moved out there, and this hogan in the sheep camp it was located on was 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. That community had no running water, no electricity. We were living in a one-room hogan with a dirt floor, log walls, an outhouse 50 yards away from the house. And we moved there because we wanted to experience the life that my grandparents lived, and even that people of my father's generation, my generation experienced as well. And so we moved there prepared to live off the grid, right? We prepared ourselves to haul our water, to live by candlelight, to cook over a camp stove or an open fire. But what caught us by surprise, what really kind of took our breath away, was once we moved there, how deeply marginalized we felt. One of the first observations I made was that by and large, the only non-natives you saw when you lived on an Indian reservation were those who came to give you charity or those who came to take your picture. And neither one of those groups were really interested in building a relationship and actually getting to know you as a person. At that same time, I was learning about the unjust history of our nation. I was experiencing the historical trauma, witnessing the historical trauma of our community from the boarding schools, from the removal. I was feeling this intense marginalization, and I could literally feel myself becoming both insecure and angry at the same time. And I was trying to process through these emotions. I was trying to understand them. I was talking with my friends from churches, from college, from other relationships I had prior to moving there, processing through what I was feeling. And every time, and over the phone, again, because they weren't coming to the reservation. And so every time we start talking about it, I could feel the anger kind of welling up in me. And I would soon have to hang up the phone lest I start yelling at my friends. So I learned how to temper myself. I learned how to talk about it like I was talking about something I read in the newspaper. When I did that, I could stay in the conversation longer. But it wasn't much beyond that my friends would start to get defensive. Well, my family didn't do that to your people. It wasn't my community that did those things. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I didn't know how to engage the dialogue in a way that let me adequately articulate what I was feeling, but also draw and keep people into the conversation. And one day I was writing a letter to my friends. This was maybe the 10th time trying to get them to understand how it felt. And in this letter, I said, being Native and living on an Indian reservation in the middle of this country, it feels like our native communities are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, the thing that causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote that and I'm like, that's it. That's how I'm feeling. I shared that with my friends and started sharing that with people I lived around, other natives on our reservation, other people in our community. And they would come back to me and say, you know, I've lived here for a long time, all my life even. I've struggled to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I would share that with non-natives, and they would come back to me and not get defensive or angry, but would say, what does it look like to say thank you? How does my family, how does my church, how does my community, how does my city, my state, even my nation express gratitude to the host people of our lands? See, now we're having a very different dialogue. Now, instead of talking about victim versus oppressor, now we're talking about what I think is the heart of the matter, which is this reversal of roles, which is we have this nation that calls itself a nation of immigrants, which is not accurate. When you call the U.S. a nation of immigrant, you are excluding African people who were brought here and enslaved, and you're excluding Native people who are indigenous to these lands and never immigrated here to join this nation in the first place. So while the majority may be a nation of immigrants, there's two very key populations that are not. And so we have this nation of quote unquote immigrants running around acting like they own the place. And we have indigenous peoples, about 6 million of us, who have been pushed aside to reservations to the margins of the country, and we're being treated like unwanted guests in someone else's house. And my work, not just in the book, but my work is really about how do we reverse these roles? How do I communicate to my nation that in some very real and practical ways, they are guests in someone else's house? And how do I communicate to our indigenous communities that in some very real and practical ways, we are the host people of the land and need to step more fully into our role as the hosts?
Yeah. Wow, thank you for that imagery. I had never thought about somebody coming into your house and locking you in the room. That helps illuminate that for me in a different way. And I love how you were talking about immigration. As you and I have discussed in prior conversations, our church has been awakening to several injustices. We started with racial injustice, and then we went to immigration injustice or migrant injustice. And so what we're hearing from you is that all of this stuff is interconnected. You can't talk about one form of oppression without talking about the other, particularly as it relates, as you said, to racial injustice against Black and brown people and immigrant injustice. Thank you for that imagery.
Yeah, I remember when we were living in that sheep camp, and this was in the early 2000s, and George Bush was just coming into office, and he was initiating a dialogue on immigration reform. And I was herding sheep one day with one of the shepherds on our reservation, and we were walking. He was a boarding school survivor. He spoke better Navajo than English, and he lived on our reservation most of his life, and he and I were out herding sheep. And I said to him as we were walking through the fields, I said, the whole nation's talking about immigration reform. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? And he said, well, there's already so many of them here. Maybe we shouldn't worry about borders anymore. Now, if you're anywhere else in the country, you immediately think he's talking about the 14 million undocumented who've come over the southern border. But because we're both Native, or because we're on the Navajo reservation, because he's a boarding school survivor, you have to at least pause and ask, is he talking about the 14 million or the 300 million undocumented who have come over these borders, mostly from Europe? And I liked the ambiguity so much, I didn't even ask him to clarify. I just left it there. And I began teaching people all over the country that if we want to comprehensively and justly reform immigration law, we need to bring the native peoples of the nation to the table. Without natives at the table, we cannot comprehensively and justly reform the law. All we have is one generation of undocumented immigrants trying to figure out what to do with another generation of undocumented immigrants, and there's no integrity in the conversation. It doesn't matter if you're building a wall to keep people out or you're tearing one down to let people in. If the indigenous peoples of the land are not there, you technically don't have the integrity to do either. And so I really began to allow that to shape my own thinking as well as my speaking on bringing Native peoples to the table, in this instance on the conversation of immigration reform, so completely changes the paradigm. And it actually helps to get down to the deeper root of the problem, which is we don't have a lot of integrity to do the things we're trying to do because we don't understand and acknowledge our history.
Whew. Yes, that is right. And speaking of that history, Mark, can you help us, and those of us particularly who did not read the book, can you help us understand some of that history? You are one of the leading voices and thinkers regarding this nation's doctrine of discovery. Can you help unpack that for us? And I'm going to say a little sidebar. As we were reading the book in the book club, many of us lamented, and I was the youngest person in the book club, many of us lamented over the fact that we did not learn half of anything you were documenting in that book. And we felt ashamed. Of course, our educational system has certainly failed us in many ways. But I was in the book club with people who were septuagenarians and in their 80s and who were weary over the idea that we have not learned much of this stuff through our schooling system. So can you help us understand that history?
Yeah, the first thing I want to point out is, while I have invested a lot of time studying and trying to understand the doctrine of discovery, and I am becoming an expert in this field, there are many others who have come before me and who are even working alongside me or in other avenues of this. One of them is Stephen Newcomb, who's written a fantastic book on the doctrine of discovery called Pagans in the Promised Land. I highly recommend his book. There's another woman I had the opportunity to meet just almost a year ago. Her name is Marcella LeBeau. She's a Native woman. She's actually a 100-year-old Army veteran. She served as a nurse during World War II. And she has educated herself and is tenacious in asking even political leaders about the doctrine of discovery and trying to bring that history more to the forefront. I met her at a forum I attended about a year ago, and I am honored to call her one of my friends today. So there are a lot of people doing some really good work out there, and I'm grateful that our book has been able to join that conversation that Soong-Chan and I wrote called on Settling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery. So the 30-second elevator version of that doctrine is the doctrine of discovery. It's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church. The first one written in 1452, the last one in 1493. It says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever land you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours for the taking. So this is the doctrine that allowed European nations to go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't think they were human. It's the same doctrine that allowed Columbus to get lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. Our book starts with the statements, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands, you can conquer those lands, you can't discover them. So the fact that today we have monuments, we have history books, we have proclamations honoring Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals our implicit racial bias, which is that Native peoples, specifically people of color in general, are not fully human. Now, this doctrine gets embedded into the foundations of the nation. So our Declaration of Independence, which 30 lines after the statement, all men are created equal, refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, which starts with the words, we the people, just a few lines later in Article 1, Section 2, this is the section that determines who is and who is not a part of the Union, who is and who is not covered by this Constitution. First of all, it never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. In 1787, that literally left white men. And technically, it was white landowning men who could vote. See, we don't think about that. The purpose of our Constitution, as written, was to protect the interests of white landowning men. In 1823, there was a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same piece of land from the government. They want to know who owned it. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. This was the John Marshall Court, considered one of our greatest jurists of the Supreme Court. They had to determine the legal precedent for land titles. Who had the right to sell the land, the country, the nation, or the native tribe? They ruled that land titles were based on discovery. That's what gave title to the land. And then they referenced the doctrine of discovery, concluded that because natives were savages, less than human, we were mere occupants of the land. Like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air. And Europeans had the right of discovery to the land, the fee title, so they became the true title holders. That case in 1823 begins to form the legal precedent for land titles. I actually gave a TEDx talk on this that you can find online. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. And in that TED talk, I lay out this case in 1823. There's actually 3 other cases that reference the doctrine of discovery by name, one in 1954, one in 1985, and the most recent one in 2005. The 2005, in the first footnote of the case, references the doctrine of discovery. And this is pertinent especially this week, that opinion was written and delivered that denied the Oneida Indian Nation rights to their traditional lands. That opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, that's the challenge, because when your land titles are based on the legal understanding that natives are savages, this makes white supremacy a bipartisan value.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's the challenge our nation needs to wrestle with. This is how deeply embedded this is we need to wrestle with this at some very foundational levels.
Yeah. It's a systemic issue for sure. And I love how you said that it crosses the partisan, what we've created as a partisan line, for sure. And I want to hold on to some of the things you said, because I'm curious about when you're talking about the wrestling we need to do with white supremacy, and this is calling on one of the questions that one of the members in our book club has. What is the Christian role in this? Where does Jesus fit in this, particularly as it relates to indigenous people? And I want to expand on that a little bit on the side. When I was doing a lot of studying of Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman and MLK, they would go on these trips across overseas and have tea with Gandhi and others. And they would always ask the African Americans, how could you be Christians in a world that used Christianity to oppress you? And so you having pastored and you're calling out white supremacy, and you're dealing in a community of people who have been oppressed by Christian or white supremacy that has been shaped under the umbrella of Christianity, how do we make sense of challenging that as Christians?
Yeah. The first 4 chapters of our book really wrestle with the question of how do you get from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine, a church doctrine that literally gives you permission to kill people who don't, or enslave them, who don't look, act, speak, or worship like you.
Mhm.
And the journey to get from there is really all about what we highlight happened in the 4th century, which is this heresy known as a Christian empire, creating of a Christian empire. When you look at the teachings of Jesus, he was very adamant he did not come to create Christian empire. He told people repeatedly his kingdom was somewhere else. You know, when Satan tempted him and showed him the kingdoms of the earth and said, if you bow down to me, I'll give them to you, Jesus said, no, that's not the goal, and he walked away. When the people saw that Jesus could feed thousands with someone's lunch, they were so excited they came to make him king by force. And Jesus walked away. He was very adamant. In fact, there was one point where his disciples came to him and they saw that there was someone else who was not a part of their group, who was out doing miracles, healing people and casting out demons. And they told him to stop. And they were quite proud of themselves. They came and reported to Jesus, hey, we found this guy doing something. He wasn't with us, so we told him to stop. And Jesus said, don't tell him to stop. Whoever gives you a cup of water in my name hasn't lost their reward. But then he goes on. And he says, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better if you wrapped a millstone around your neck and jumped into the ocean. He said, if your right hand causes you to think you're better than someone else because you're with me, cut it off. It's better to go into life maimed than with 2 arms to be thrown into the fires of hell. Jesus saves his most stark warnings, not for the sinners and the tax collectors, not for the religious leaders, not for the Roman emperors. His most stark warnings, his threats of hell, where he's the most pointed about them, are when his disciples began thinking that because they're with Jesus, they're better than other people. And so when we have now in the 4th century, and we highlight not only the conversion of Constantine, but the writings of Eusebius, who is seeing the persecution of the church. It's actually touching him, friends and family, he's witnessing it, and he wants it to end. And so he props up Constantine as the God-ordained emperor of Rome. And creating this heresy known as a Christian empire. And when the church, Constantine grabs onto that, he converts, and he fundamentally changes the church. Now he creates a Christian empire. And in the 5th century, Augustine, who is trying to wrestle with this, asks a very pointed question and says, what's the role of a Christian king in a Christian empire? This is in his book on the correction of the Donatists. It's a good question. The Christians have always been oppressed. They've never been in power. And he's saying, what's the role of a Christian in power? The problem with this question is he accepts the premise that there's such a thing as a Christian empire. There's not if you read Jesus anyway. And so he concludes, actually, that the role of the Christian king in the Christian empire is to compel people through fear, punishment, and pain to worship God and obey the teachings of the church, which is clearly not what Jesus ever said. And so this is the problem. When you have Christian empire, you now have to find a way to mandate people and compel them to obey the commands of the church and of the scriptures, which is not the role of empire, of anyone. That's not even the role of the church. We are to invite people. We are not told to compel them, to force them to believe these things. And so when you have a Christian empire, you now have to enforce the theologies and the rules of your religion, which is not the way it's supposed to work. So that's where the church begins going down this slippery slope. Now that it's a Christian empire, which is a heresy, but now it has to enforce the teachings of the scriptures. Now it needs to begin compelling people through fear, punishment, and pain. And that's what eventually leads to the writing of the Doctrine of Discovery. It was Aquinas who said, well, if the secular kingdoms of the world can kill people for breaking man's laws, how much more right does the church have to kill people who break God's laws? And that's what eventually leads to the writing of the Doctrine of Discovery and to the situation we have, even how it gets embedded into the foundations of our church, of our country. And so, yeah, it's a those 4 chapters were probably some of the most challenging chapters to write, because we're really pointing to some very specific points in church history, some very stark warnings of Jesus, and then seeing how, because the church accepts this teaching, it leads to this incredibly genocidal, ethnic cleansing, enslavement laden history that the church actually supports and invigorates rather than prophesies and tries to prohibit.
Yes. Thank you for that. I think it's one of the main questions that people are wrestling with as they try to even understand what this means for their walk with God or their following of the teachings of Jesus. What role must they play in divesting from empire? I want to invite those of you who have questions to type them in the chat. We have a few questions popping up. To close out our initial conversation, Mark, I do want to ask you about the Lakota people. You had a very poignant statement when you reminded me that the Lakota people said that the mountains were not for sale. What does reparations look like? I know you talked about apology in your initial story and nobody saying thank you to the grandmother, but what does it look like? Is there anything that could be done to repair what has been breached?
Yeah, let me expand this a little bit, and we'll talk about the whole concept of reparations. So even during in the last year, our nation has talked about reparations. It came up during the Democratic primaries a lot, especially for our history of enslavement and for, the people who are who have ancestors who were enslaved. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about, because if you understand our history, right, we've never abolished slavery. If you read the 13th Amendment, what it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. So we've never abolished slavery. We've redefined and codified it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And so to talk today about reparations for our history of enslavement, if you ever witnessed or watched a class action lawsuit where you have a lot of people suing a corporation for some unjust injustice they've enacted, and usually those lawsuits get settled. They don't go to court because they're so pricey, they're so fraught with liability that they get settled. And if there's a settlement and you get a piece of that settlement, you have to go to court and usually have to sign a paper that says you are waiving your right to sue over this issue again. And then you will get whatever settlement it was. So what I encourage, especially members of our African American community about, is I absolutely believe reparations are due. The injustice was taken, labor was stolen, and reparations are due. But if we let the nation pay the fine, pay the reparation, before it actually abolishes slavery, we're not going to ever get it abolished, right? And so we have to just think about this differently. And one of the things we need to do is, because of the Doctrine of Discovery, the United States of America, Western Christianity, even most of Western Europe, the colonizing nations, have a relationship with the natural environment of exploitation and profit. My father was on a task force for our denomination. This was over 15 years ago, probably, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And in this task force, they were looking at creation care. And he was the only Native man in the committee. And they were talking about environmental crisis and what's going on environmentally. And my father said to them, he said, well, the reason the nation the US doesn't know how to care for the environment is because it has a doctrine of discovery. And people looked at him like, what are you talking about? He said, look it up. So they Googled it right there, and they blew their minds. They're like, you know, this invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. This sets up a exploiting relationship between the people in power and those beneath them, which also influences your relationship with the environment. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that because our country is based on this doctrine of discovery, we have value, an implicit value for exploitation and profit. This is just the way we think. This is the way even consumerism and capitalism works, right? If this is why you have to write a specific law to protect the environment, but you can sue a corporation for not maximizing the profits of the shareholders. Because we have this understanding that if you're not maximizing your profit, if you're not doing if you're not doing all that, then you're not thinking clearly. And so part of our job is to retrain our nation, to help them understand how to think and interact with the environment differently. Mm-hmm. And I love the example of the Dakota people, because the Mount Rushmore was stolen from them, right? It was stolen from them. Actually, it's the Lakota people who it was stolen from them. And after the land was stolen and the faces of some of our most genocidal white supremacist presidents were engraved onto this mountain, the country felt bad about it and offered to pay the Lakota people for those mountains. And the Lakota said to them, they're not for sale. You can't pay us for those mountains. There's literally about $1 billion sitting in a trust fund right now that the US government has offered to pay the Lakota for Mount Rushmore, and the Lakota said they're not for sale. You can't pay us for them. This is what was so beautiful about Standing Rock, right? We had tens of thousands of Native peoples from hundreds of tribes coming together, committed deeply to the wisdom of our elders, to prayer and ceremony and peaceful protest, coming together and telling this colonial nation that you can't drink oil and water is life. This is what it looks like to step into our role as the host. This is what it looks like, that while, yes, there has to be some sort of cost and economic justice, but the way it usually plays out is when you pay reparations, when you pay your fine, you're not actually even admitting guilt. You're just paying the price for whatever the injustice was, and nothing is really being learned. And so part of what we have to think about is, how do we actually, not only make things just out of the situation, but how do we actually teach this nation that has not learned to not exploit and misuse the environment and people? Mm-hmm. And so I love that example of the Lakota people. I love that example of what happened at Standing Rock, where I think as we step more fully into our role as the hosts, it allows us to take on the role of teacher, or mentor, or of host of these lands, and teaching the people who have colonized it how to live here better.
Yes. Thank you for that. And thank you for bringing up creation and the lands. We just almost completed before the pandemic, a year of awakening to environmental injustice. And so, as we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this stuff, it's all coming together.
Yeah, it astounded me as I began studying how much this doctrine of discovery is really some of the root that connects so many of these injustices that we're facing as a nation, and that the church has been facing for thousands of years. And when we understand it much more at the root, at the foundational level, it makes it easier but it's hard to address it, but it helps us understand, okay, this is where it's rooted, so we can actually address it there, rather than only keep, cutting off branches and chopping off leaves and not ever getting to the root of the problem.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. We have a few questions rolling in here, Mark, so
Okay.
if you don't mind. Our first question is from Matt Clark. He read the book and he has a brief quote that he wants to ask a question about. So it was on page 188, and the quote said, "The hope for America comes from the character of God. And the character of God is accessed through a humility that emerges from the spiritual practice of lament. Lament calls for truth-telling that reveals the underlying trauma and can lead to the promise of healing." This is from Unsettling Truths, page 188. Matt's question is, "My impression is that these statements are addressed to people of faith. With the great number of people who do not attend a church, do not believe in a God, or attend a church and it is of white supremacy persuasion, is lament an adequate antidote to the centuries of fallout from the doctrine of discovery?"
Yeah, that's a very good question. And so much of what we need, well, so much what I try to focus on is when I write, when I speak, when I communicate in any way, is I have to have a very good understanding of who my audience is. So when I wrote the book with Seung-Chan Rah, who is a professor at North Park Theological Seminary, we published it through InterVarsity Press. The audience of our book was the church. And we addressed the church very specifically. The book started out as a call to lament, and over the process of writing it, turned into a flat out rebuke of the church and calling it to get out of bed with empire. The way, and so the arguments we made throughout the book are all about how the church deals with these things and what the church has done, how the church is complicit in this history. The way I bring people outside the church into this conversation is I tell them, and I've actually used a lot of the content from the book in even my public lectures, because I tell people, if you don't understand the history of the church, you will never understand the history of the nation. Like we like to say as a country, we have a separation of church and state. We don't. The identity of the church and the identity of the nation are so unbelievably intertwined. If you don't understand the history of the church, you will never fully understand the history of the nation. And so my call to the church, and even in talking about it, when I give these lectures and when I go out, there's a lot of different audiences I'm trying to prep. So one audience is the church, and the church's entryway into this dialogue that I'm trying to create. The church's entry point is through lament. Mm-hmm. I also have other groups where I'm talking to people of color, I'm talking to millennials, I'm talking to other groups, and I'm trying to prepare our nation. My goal of this book and my goal in writing the book was, I believe the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation that I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I wouldn't call ours Truth and Reconciliation, though, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. And if you understand our history on race, that's not accurate. Mm-hmm. Race was created specifically for the purpose of oppressing and dividing. So racial reconciliation is a misnomer, because the whole concept of race is to actually oppress and divide. And so I would use the term truth and conciliation. I would use the frame racial conciliation. Conciliation is merely the mediation of a dispute. If reconciliation perpetuates the myth of the past, conciliation gives us a much more honest starting point. They both lead to a better ending point. One's just more honest than the other. And so my entry point for people from outside the church, my entry point for the nation into this dialogue, is through what I would call the creation of common memory. There's a quote used by Georges Erasmus, who's a Dene elder from one of the tribes up in Canada. And he used this quote when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Mm-hmm. If you want to build community, he said, you need to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it's genius. It gets to the heart of our nation's problem, specifically around race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. And we have communities of color, Native communities, African American communities, other communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands and broken treaties, of slavery and Jim Crow laws, of Indian massacres and boarding schools, of internment camps, of segregation, mass incarceration, families being ripped apart at our borders, and there's no common memory. And there's no point you can look back over American history and say there was healthy community across racial lines. That doesn't exist. And so my entry point for the church, because the church wrote the doctrine of discovery and has been embedded with empire for 1700 years, my entry point for the church in the church's language is through the process of lament. My call for the nation is we have this history we've never wrestled with. We have these stories we refuse to hear. We do not have a common memory, and this is one of the primary reasons we don't have healthy community. And so if we can begin to create that common memory, we can now move forward into hopefully a healthier community. So it's understanding who my audience is and what I'm trying to persuade them of and what's the best way to bring them into this dialogue on race, gender, and class, leading towards a Truth and Conciliation Commission.
Thank you for that distinction. That was very helpful for me as well. We have another question here. It says, in a sense, aren't Native Americans immigrants too? They came over to North America by way of the Bering Strait from Siberia some 12,000 or 13,000 years ago. I'm not completely 100% sure about the accuracy of all of the people who came over the strait, but what are your thoughts on that question?
My thoughts on that question is there are a lot of different oral histories. This was obviously before there was a written history. And there's a lot of different theories of how different groups got here. When I was in college, I actually did some research, and I took that possible theory of a migration route across through Russia and Canada, and then down this way through Alaska. And I laid it side by side with our creation story and said, is it the way a creation story is even kind of doing some of these? I didn't come to any conclusion. While it's true that people have migrated for for all of time, and creation stories are about what give us space. They help us understand where we are in our space. And the challenge is, well, so what I'm trying to do right now is today, we have a nation with a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, and Supreme Court case precedents that say white landowning men are superior and everyone else is less than. And I'm trying to address that and saying, how do we actually get to a place where we can have healthy community across racial lines, across gender lines, across sexual identity lines, across economic lines? How can we have a healthier community? What's the best way to do that? Well, we have to address what we're built on. We're built on these foundations that have this doctrine of discovery and this lie of white supremacy literally written into them. And so I am trying to address that. Has there been injustice in the past? Have a lot of us migrated here from? That's very possible. That's not going to help me answer this question. Because we're not living on laws and on foundations built on those belief systems 10, 15, 20,000 years ago. We are living in a nation that is run by a constitution written a little over 250 years ago. And so we have to address this. We have to talk about this and find a way to deal with it. And so that's what I'm trying to work on. It's not that I'm saying this place was nirvana before Europeans came over here. No, I'm not going to live in that fantasy either. But I am going to say we have to deal with what was written into our Constitution, what was written into our foundations. What division did that cause, and how do we now find a way to address it moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. Thank you. Sometimes we tend to dwell on, the past and some of the unknowns. And at this point, we're trying to demand equality and justice that goes far beyond many of the things that happened before we were even able to write history down.
And this is another point along those same lines. One of the points we make, I think it's in chapter 9 or 10 of the book, is one of the challenges the United States of America faces is it's never lost a war that matters. And when you lose a war, well, history is written by the victors. And so because we've never lost a war that matters, we've been able to write our own history for 250 years.
Yeah.
Now, that history is not accurate, right?
Yeah.
Most people have no clue that Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist and that he was one of the most genocidal presidents in the history of our nation, literally ethnically cleansing the states of Minnesota, Colorado, and New Mexico to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. People don't know that. Because why? Because he won the war, not the Civil War. That was an internal spat between white supremacist people from the North and South. He won the War of Manifest Destiny. He was able to lay the groundwork to complete the Transcontinental Railway. He was able to ethnically cleanse the native tribes who were in the way of that Manifest Destiny being completed. Had he not won that, had he not been able to remove the Dakota and the Winnebago from Minnesota, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho from Colorado, and the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico, we probably would know nothing about him. So again, history is written by the victors. The U.S. has won its wars for 250 years. And in all honesty, the Navajo people, we were literally ethnically cleansed out of the Southwest. We lost a very major war. And we were ethnically cleansed brutally from our lands in the Southwest. And that experience changes your perspective. Having lived through, knowing that what happened to my people changes my perspective. When you look at World War II, I asked this question in the book, I asked it when I lecture, if you let's pretend that Nazi Germany wins World War II. How would their history books treat Adolf Hitler? Well, he'd be their greatest leader ever. How would their history books treat the Holocaust? Well, we have Holocaust deniers today. Imagine if they won the war. What Holocaust? There was no Holocaust, right? In Nazi Germany, they teach the Holocaust. Why? So they can do it better next time? No, so they never do it again. We literally killed hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children in the Pacific Islands at the end of World War II. In fact, McNamara, who was an analyst for General LeMay, who was leading the bombing raids in the Pacific Theater, he said that if we lost the war, LeMay, McNamara, the other ones who were planning these raids, he said they would be tried as war criminals. And in his documentary about his life, The Fog of War, McNamara said he was right. We were acting as war criminals. Well, they didn't get tried as war criminals. Why? Because they weren't acting unjustly? No, because we won the war. And so he got medals when he came out of the Army. He got medals, even though he went on to become the Secretary of Defense, and he helped be the architect of the Vietnam War, including the use of Agent Orange.
Yeah.
And we honored him. We put medals upon him. Why? Because he wasn't acting unjustly? No, because we won the war. And so this is the challenge we face as a nation, is we've never lost a war that matters, which means we've been able to write a mythological history of ourselves for the past 250 years. And it means we have not wrestled with, right? We just passed the 75th anniversary a few months ago of the dropping of atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the country hardly batted an eye. We killed hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, those two bombing raids weren't even the worst raids we had. It was Operation Meeting House, the incendiary bombing of Tokyo. That was the most deadly. We killed 100,000 people in a single night. We didn't even bat an eye. Why? Because we won that war. So this is the challenge we face as a nation, is we've never lost a war that matters. We've written a mythological history, and we need people, including the native voices, who most of us have lost wars at the hands of the United States. And our voices are so necessary to help people understand the horrors of what was enacted.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And always a reminder that there are so many gaps in our education, and I'm constantly wrestling with that, and how much of both it was a myth that was written, and even so much of the myth wasn't even taught right in schools and such. So we are still learning and growing. I think we have time for one more question, one more final question. Yeah. So this is from Kathleen. Kathleen wants to know this. One of the central tenets of fundamentalist Christianity is that all non-Christians will be sentenced to eternal damnation. This was used to enslave non-Christians. These beliefs are still alive and prevalent. Given what we've been discussing tonight, how do we deal with this? Since you said the book is, that's the end of her question, but since you said the book is really to Christians, sort of which Christians, and how do we deal with this idea that if you are a non-believer, you're already sentenced to some sort of hell?
Yeah, the book doesn't go into that. And that's not what I'm trying to wrestle with in this book. You know, one of the things that I repeated this over and over, is the United States of America is not, never has been, nor will it ever be Christian. If you think your faith is about making your nation Christian, then you haven't studied the teachings of Jesus very well. Because he was quite adamant. One of the interactions I like best about Jesus was when he was out teaching, and he was approached by a rich young ruler, right? And this young man came up to him and he said, "How do I get to heaven?" And Jesus said, "Well, do these things, A, B, C, D, and E." He gave him a list of things to do. The guy said, "Cool, I've done those, I'm in." Jesus said, "Well, hold on, go sell everything and then come and follow me." And the rich young ruler walked away because he had great wealth and he didn't want to give it up. Now, what's amazing about that interaction is Jesus lets the guy walk, right? A Western Christian, especially from my generation, or older, we would never let that happen, right? We would do something. We would call them names. "Hey, you're a fool, you're an idiot," you know, to try and get them to turn around. We would grab their arms and twist it. "I don't care what you say, you're going to follow me and like it." You know, we would go up and say, "Well, you don't have to give everything away. Just don't sell everything. Just give away something nice." We'd lower the bar. We'd do something to compel the person to come. Because why? We think our job is to make them believe, instead of just to teach the truth. The guy asked Jesus a question. Jesus told the answer. The guy's like, "Okay, yeah, I don't like that answer." And he walked away, and Jesus let him walk. He still had to see him in the synagogue. He still had to run into him in the marketplace. Jesus seemed fine to live in this. Rome was a very plural, that area, Rome, the nation that was colonizing them, was a very pluralistic society. They had gods for everything. I'm not saying Christianity is a pluralistic value for I'm not saying pluralism is a Christian value, but I would say that Christianity can thrive in a pluralistic environment. And so Jesus seemed fine with the guy asked the question. Jesus told him the honest answer. The guy didn't like that. And Jesus said, okay, fine, you can walk away. You're still, we're still in this nation together. I'll still see you in the synagogue. I'll still run into you at the marketplace. We're still here together. And I think that's one of the things that, especially I see Western Christians, they feel so strongly that their job is to convert people, to compel people to believe, that they're not comfortable with waiting till they're asked a question, giving an honest answer, and allowing people to actually make their own decisions. Mm-hmm. And then continue to live in society alongside them.
Yeah.
But even though we see Jesus do that, we don't feel, many Christians don't feel comfortable doing that. And this is, in my own work, and especially when I lived on the Navajo Nation for 11 years with my family. And on the Navajo Nation, you have people like my grandparents who were converted into boarding schools and gave up their culture so that they could have faith. You have other people who were hurt by the boarding schools and want nothing to do with the church. And you have another group of people who are following the traditional religion and want nothing to do with the church either. Mm-hmm. And if you want to have an effective witness in that environment, you actually need to learn how to talk about your faith without talking about your faith. I wrote a piece for, I forget, it was some publication. I put it on my blog as well too. And I told the story of a friend I was with, and I had a chance to be with him. He was a boarding school survivor and was incredibly mistreated in the boarding schools. And because of that mistreatment, wanted nothing to do with the church. He knew I was a Christian. He knew my family was a Christian. And he died a few years ago, and I had a chance to be with him just before he died. And we talked. We had some very deep conversations. He knew the work I was doing on the Doctrine of Discovery. He knew the book I was writing. He was very supportive of this stuff I was doing. But he was adamant he wasn't going to have anything to do with my faith. And we sat there and we talked, and I knew it was going to be the last time I was going to see him before he died. And yet I also knew I couldn't even invite him or try to introduce him to Jesus because he had been so hurt in the name of Jesus in the past. Mm. And I felt like that's one of the huge challenges we face as a nation, as a church, is because of the way we've been in bed with empire. Because of the unbelievable injustices that we have not only justified, but enacted. In so many cases, the church doesn't have a leg to stand on. It doesn't have a witness. And we need the humility to acknowledge that. Rather than saying, well, get over it, at least God still loves you. I've had people tell me that all the time. It's like, you just need to acknowledge you don't have a witness right now. Until you're able to live your faith out with some level of integrity, and until you're able to deal with the injustice that was justified and enacted on behalf of the church. We just have, this is literally how we end the book. Mm-hmm. Where we say, because of the history the church has been engaged in, because of the things that we've done, the church actually doesn't have a role right now in healing the racial injustice. Mm-hmm. Because if you were to ask the Western church what the solution is, their solution would be what caused the problem. Well, we need the nation to be more Christian. That's what caused the problem. trying to compel faith.
Yeah.
So to acknowledge, until we get out of bed with empire, until we can learn how to allow people to walk away, until we can learn how to be humble with this faith that we've been given, we have actually no role in healing the damage that we've caused. And that's humbling.
Thank you for that. I'm taking with me the humility. I'm gonna linger with that a little bit. Humility and lament. I think that is such a powerful charge. The charge to be humble.
Yeah.
Which is counter what what we've been taught about church. But I think that we are called toward humility. Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for this enlivening conversation. For those who don't know, Mark will be preaching on Sunday in our worship service. And so we're excited to hear your voice again on Sunday.
Well, thank you. This has been a really good conversation. I thank you for the great questions you've asked. I am grateful I had a chance to talk with some members of your congregation and a chance to answer some of the questions. And I look forward to preaching with you and being with you on Sunday.
Yes, thank you. For those of you who are interested, we will be doing another book club on the book in November. Details are forthcoming. So please send me emails. If you have further questions that I can perhaps pass on to Mr. Charles, we can do that as well. Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for attending. I wish you all a wonderful evening and see you on Sunday morning.
Hakonat, it's great to see you. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.